Jesus Christ, His only Son. I believe in the virgin birth.
On our new book, Evangelical Calvinism, Volume 2, Dogmatics and Devotion. Essays resourcing the continuing reformation of the Church. And it's a volume, obviously it's volume 2, so it's a volume that followed our first volume, which came out in 2012, titled Evangelical Calvinism, simply essays resourcing the continuing reformation of the Church. So we plan on doing, Mike Habitz and myself, plan on doing a total of 4 volumes in this series of books, edited books. And the first book was primarily just focused on introducing what we are identifying as Evangelical Calvinism, and trying to get into some of the doctrinal, theological foundations that underwrite our style of Evangelical Calvinism. So that's what we are hoping to accomplish with our first volume. And I think particularly through our chapter 15 that Mike and I co-wrote in that first volume EC book, I think we accomplished that, at least insofar as presenting something that could be critiqued and reflected upon. And we had some feedback and some critique on that, of course. Probably the most high-profile feedback or critique that we received came from Kevin Van Hooser, professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And I'm sure many of you listening to this, if you're listening to this, know of him. But yeah, he offered a chapter-length critique, excuse me, of a few of our theses, primarily our view of salvation being more ontologically focused rather than the more classical Reformed approach, which focuses on declarative righteousness and imputed righteousness. He's critiquing the participationist contour of thought that is present in a very prominent way, in an ontological way, relative to soteriology, to salvation. He doesn't think that's Pauline in his critique. So anyways, so we received feedback from Van Hooser. Roger Olson did some blog posts and critique. He didn't really seem to grasp what we were getting at. Kevin Van Hooser does. So the second volume, was subtitled Dogmatics and Devotion, is intended to continue on with the development of the theological aspects of Evangelical Calvinism. But it's also intended to be even more accessible for a larger audience, insofar as that's determined by the topics being considered themselves. And so, just as our first volume, it's an edited volume by Mike Habitz and myself, and in this volume we had, once again, just a great lineup of contributors. Let me just read through the table of contents so you get just a feel for what it's all about. So we had a foreword done by Oliver Crisp, which is good, and introducing what we're about, and he also offers a little bit of his criticism, at least suggestively, in the foreword. But it's a good critical foreword. Then chapter 1 is Introduction on Dogmatics and Devotion in the Christian Life, that was covered by Mike and myself. And then our part 1 is made up of chapters 2 through 5. Chapter 2 is Crossing the Epistemological Impasse, Thinking out of a Center in God and not out of a center in ourselves, by Mike Habitz. Chapter 3 is done by yours truly, Bobby Grow, and the title is Assurance is the Essence of Saving Faith, Calvin, Bart, Torrance, and the Faith of Christ. Chapter 4 is The Word Became Flesh, John Williamson Nevin, Charles Hodge, and the Antichrist. That's written by Marcus Johnson out of Moody Bible Institute. Chapter 5 is called Perichoretic Salvation by James Gifford Jr. Then we move to part 2, starting with chapter 6, The Advent of Ministry, Torrance on Eschatology, the Church and Ministry by Andrew Purves. Chapter 7, The Principal Point on which our whole salvation turns, Calvin on the Vicarious Priesthood of Jesus Christ by John Clark, also out of Moody Bible Institute and colleague of Marcus Johnson. Chapter 8 is The Problem with Preferential Love. Should love depend upon my initiative? A challenge for Reformed theology, an answer from the Vicarious Humanity of Christ by Christian Kettler. He's out of Friends University in Kansas. Chapter 9, The Vicarious Humanity of Christ as a Basis of Christian Spirituality by Jason Radcliffe. Chapter 10, The Vicarious Humanity of Christ in Sanctification by Alexandra Radcliffe, Jason's wife. Now we move to part 3 of the book, starting with chapter 11. Christ and Culture Toward a Contextual Theology, Eric Flett, Andrew Picard, and Mike Habitz. That was obviously a co-written chapter. Chapter 12, The Pastoral Function of Calvin's Doctrine of Election by Victor Shepard. Chapter 13, Calvin's Awful Health and God's Awesome Providence by W. Allen Hogg, M.D., and Charles Partee. Chapter 14, John Calvin and the Weekly Prayer Meeting by Douglas Kelly. Chapter 15, What Kind of Ministry? David Torrance. So Thomas and James Torrance's brother, surviving brother. Chapter 16, Preaching Christ, Grace, Faith, and Assurance. David Torrance. So 2 chapters from David, which we are much appreciated, since anybody who has followed us understands how important Thomas in particular has been for the formation of evangelical Calvinism. Even the language itself we picked up from Thomas Torrance in his book Scottish Theology, from John Knox to John MacLeod Campbell. Anyways, chapter 17, The Form of Formation, Trinitarian Christian Participation as the Way of Christian Formation by Jordy Ziegler. Chapter 18, On Prayer and the Criticism of the Political and Cultural Positioning of Religion by Scott Kirkland. And chapter 19, Scripturing the Performance of Neighborly Personhood, Theology's Transformative Reading with John Calvin by John McDowell, to round out the book. And then we do have an index of authors, index of subjects, and index of biblical references. So I really like this book a lot, actually. I like it, I think, even a little better in our volume 1 for different reasons. I just like the topic, or the topics that are under consideration. Primarily, just the heavy focus on the doctrine of the vicarious humanity of Christ, and that really does get into what Kevin Van Hooser critiqued us of, as far as salvation and our focus on the ontology, the ontological aspect of salvation. In other words, when I say that, I'm referring to how we focus on how salvation at base has to do with humanity, our humanity. And so it's focusing salvation as a frame more on what it means to be human before God, coram Deo, versus the typical forensic and juridical framing that we, again, so often find framing classical Calvinism, as I call it, or federal theology, or classical covenant theology, which necessarily has a juridical or forensic frame because it starts with the covenant of works, and that in and of itself is a legal understanding of the relationship between God and Adam and Eve in the garden. And that's how we're introduced to the relationship in covenant theology between God and humanity. And so necessarily so, classical Calvinism has its rootage, no matter how it blossoms one way or the other, it has its rootage in a legal forensic frame of reference relative to its understanding of God and man and humanity in relationship. And so we approach things differently in evangelical Calvinism, and we focus as I've wrote a blog post on my recently, on more of an Eastern approach, not wanting to press the Eastern-Western divide too much, as that the de regnon thesis of that divide has been ameliorated quite a bit by the work of someone like Louis Ayres and others. But that has a lot to do with the doctrine of God more than soteriological issues, but it does implicate soteriological issues. So I don't want to press the Eastern-Western divide too much is all I'm saying. But what I am saying is that insofar as we focus on something like theosis, a reformed doctrine of theosis as present in Thomas Torrance's theology, which Mike Habitz did his PhD research on and is now published by Ashgate in his book Theosis and the Theology of Thomas Torrance. I believe that came out in 2009. That is definitely a fundamental aspect of the way that we view salvation. And we view it then within a certain doctrine of creation, which is tensed and conditioned by a doctrine of Jesus Christ. And so there is obviously, just as in any theological schema, a particular order that we follow in the way that we attempt to unpack things doctrinally and theologically within a relative order of things. And so, we start with the doctrine of God, and we see God's inner life itself, following Karl Barth, as the covenant of grace, if we're going to use or reuse or redress those classical categories of covenant theology itself. We see God's inner triune life as the inner reality of the covenant between God and man, and we then see that externalized in temporal creation, which then is the outer basis of the covenant. But all of it's encompassed by God's election to not be God without us, but with us in Jesus Christ, as Emmanuel, God with us. And so this is where we start our thinking. We don't start it from the Augustinian approach, which again underwrites so much of, all of classical Reformed theology. Well, I shouldn't say all of, because I believe what we are presenting is a part of classical Reformed theology. It's just underrepresented. But let me not digress there. So, yes. So in contrast to this more soteriologically driven, conceived Calvinism, which starts with creation and then begins to speak of covenant, etc. Because just think of it in a kind of a logical way, not necessarily or a chronological way, not necessarily a logical way. Just chronologically, if you have a covenant of works as a basis of relationship between God and man, what does that presuppose? First, it presupposes that creation existed to begin with, before this relationship between God and man could be established in this covenant of works, this legal relationship that they were not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so, necessarily so, covenant theology starts by placing creation, at least epistemologically, prior to covenant, because a covenant is made within the framework of an already existing creation. The way evangelical Calvinists think of covenant, as I was just mentioning, following Karl Barth, is to think of God's life itself as a covenant relations, as we think of election in a pretemporal sense, occurring